Okay, I finally got to catch up with Dark Phoenix, 2019's X-Men installment. And I have to say, first off, before I get any further, that I just don't know why this movie was made. Well, I know why all movies are made. They're made to make a profit, right? That's the point of making anything. But I just don't understand this movie largely in the context of the X-Men universe, Fox's X-Men universe. It's just pointless. Like, it serves no purpose and it doesn't add anything. It's slightly boring, and I think it definitely deserves to be rotten. Although on Rotten Tomatoes, the critics say it's at 23%, making it rotten. And the audience score, surprisingly, is at 64%, meaning that enough people gave it positive reviews just to keep it slightly out of being considered rotten. Um, I say there's no accounting for taste. People are very forgiving, or perhaps people that really weren't into the X-Men franchise to begin with. Um, they just considered it passable fare, passable action movie stuff. But really, in the context of all the other X-Men movies in the franchise, it's pointless. It actually brings everything down a notch. A lot of it doesn't make sense. And it gives you the feeling that between the original three X-Men movies and the kind of alternate universe reboot with the younger characters, that this X-Men franchise has been rebooted and retconned and adjusted in so many weird ways. The relationships between the characters, the timelines involved, that it just doesn't make any sense anymore. And it's a good thing that this is the last in that installment. It needed to die. Now, I did a review on X-Men Apocalypse, and I didn't find it completely rotten. I thought it was entertaining. But most people say it's a toss-up between Apocalypse and Dark Phoenix for the worst X-Men film. I'd say Dark Phoenix is worse just because it's more boring than Apocalypse. And you'll notice right off the top, I have to mention the most obvious thing is that this is not called X-Men Dark Phoenix. This is called simply Dark Phoenix. So if you asked somebody on the street, hey, did you see Dark Phoenix? They might not know exactly what you mean because, if I ask somebody on the street, hey, did you see X-Men Apocalypse or X-Men The Last Stand or whatever, they're going to know exactly what I mean. However, they chose to title this Dark Phoenix. They took X-Men off of it. And this was in 2019 before all the current woke stuff was going on like it is now. So I have to wonder, is it because they didn't really want it associated with like somebody along the line before this was released? Maybe they realized this wasn't the best thing to put into the franchise. I don't know, but it's rather telling that something's going on when they didn't put X-Men colon Dark Phoenix. They put just Dark Phoenix. And so here we are, Dark Phoenix. And yes, you have all your X-Men characters, the ones from the rebooted or reimagined crew. And again, I'll say, like I did in my review for Apocalypse, that X-Men First Class was fantastic, and X-Men Days of Future Past was even better, in my opinion. And this is unworthy to be in the same franchise with those. And again, it further retcons and changes things. And of course, most glaringly, these characters haven't aged at all. Between First Class and this movie, these characters have supposedly aged 30 years plus, yet they look like they've aged about 5 years, like they have in the real world. That's a big problem. They're not all ageless. They're not all Wolverine. They are simply people that age normally, uh, separately than their powers. Yet they all look exactly the same. It doesn't make any sense. You can't just shave off, McAvoy's hair and say that he's aged 30 years. It doesn't work because the first X-Men film shows him as Patrick Stewart, an old Patrick Stewart, yet this movie is nearly in the same time period, but You can even argue it's an alternate version, but how do you explain that he hasn't aged in 30 years? Why is he still very much looking like he's late 30s, early 40s? Doesn't make sense. The same thing with Magneto. It doesn't fit at all. It doesn't explain anything. And the relationships between the characters, even though 30 years have passed, there's no evidence that these characters have known each other for 30 years, even the enemies. Doesn't add up, doesn't feel real. This whole thing feels pointless, and it suffers from something that some of the other X-Men films also suffer from, in that these characters, some of them have incredible powers, and yet they just simply choose not to use these powers when the plot demands that they don't. When the plot needs that they just stand there and watch something occurring, that's what they do. And later in the film, the same character with these immense powers will suddenly use these powers in some way because the plot needs them to. It doesn't work. It's a failure of writing. Even comic books, the writing is far superior to this. That's the point. Real writing would show you why there's a compelling story with these superpowered characters. Here you just have these superpowered characters thrown together, and when the plot demands that they just suddenly decide not to use their powers, they just don't. And it also suffers from things like there's a scene in which Magneto really strains hard to use his incredible magnetic powers just to pull a subway car out of a subway tunnel beneath them in New York, just for the purpose of blocking a doorway. Like, what? It makes no damn sense. And that's not all of it. That's just the worst one I could take off the top of my head. There's a lot of that in this film. The film also takes characters that, well, for example, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you have the Skrulls introduced in Captain Marvel. Obviously, they're introduced here too. It's the same alien race. They're just not called the Skrulls. They're called something else. Maybe there's a licensing issue. I don't know. I'm sure others spoke to this, but it's obvious they have the Skrulls, but they couldn't call them the Skrulls. And they're the exact same thing. And the villain is a Skrull called something else. And there's two different things going on here trying to drive the plot. You have these Skrull-like villains led by Jessica Chastain. And you have this anomalous energy force that's like moving throughout the universe that also starts this whole thing off story-wise. Two things going on here that they try to put together into one plot, and along with Jean Grey turning evil and killing other X-Men, and there's so much stuff going on here with nothing to make it logical. I don't, let's just get into the audience reviews. Again, 64% on the audience score. I would say it deserves to be lower. It's definitely worthy of being rotten. That's why I'm doing a rotten review on it. And let's get right to the audience reviews and see what other people say. Again, not going to entertain 4- and 5-star reviews. That wouldn't be fair to anyone. So here we go. 2-star review 6 days ago. Making this in... making it in June of 2020. So, 2 stars. I must admit I never been a big fan of the X-Men movies, but by far this is the worst of all of them. Jean suddenly turns against Professor X and ends up killing a few of her X-Men members. Yeah, that's a big part of this. That's what was promised in the trailers, and yet that's not actually the biggest thing going on. You have this other confusing stuff with the Skrulls that aren't Skrulls and the giant energy force. It's like, wow, so much stuff thrown together. It's like the writers couldn't make up their mind. What was the driving thing of the plot of this? Putting it all together just made all of it kind of weak. 2.5 stars, June 3rd. Where did it all go so wrong? A star-studded cast playing characters we've grown to love were not enough to save this wreckage of a film. Predictable and uninspiring dialogue, a plot that saw every character predictably change sides multiple times, and the obvious fear of being dwarfed by prior films in the series to the extent that they took the plot to a place that they thought was bigger and better than any before it, space. Well, it didn't work. Yeah, they brought in aliens, galactic energy force of some kind. yeah, it's, you would think it would be bigger and better. Hell, they even went to space. Just allowing, just not nitpicking the science of it or anything going on with that. It just, it tried to do all this grand stuff, but it felt like it was done by people that really didn't give a crap. Like whoever produced this film just ultimately just like crammed all this together like a last minute homework assignment and threw it at the wall to see if it would stick. Definitely didn't work. It's like just they threw it out there and they half-assed it. It very much felt like a half-assed job. Half a star. The storyline is very typical. There's no depth to it. Very cliche dialogues. It's just really bad. Yeah, I didn't notice the dialogue was that bad. It had so many other problems, and I normally I nitpick what's going on with the performances, but I could say that Sophie Turner isn't good or I didn't like it, but she's never been anything. She's never been in anything with her as the driving character that was that great. I mean, she was like a side character in Game of Thrones, and she still is to me. And she wasn't disastrous, but she wasn't anything great either. All of the other characters, I can't say their performances were good or bad because there were just so many other problems with this thing that was not on my mind. Um, I would say that the biggest problem with the characters is that between all these movies, their relationships change so much and go back and forth, and not just switching sides, but their motivations. And, they've known each other supposedly for 30 years by the time this film occurs, and you don't feel any of that. It feels like, again, they're just like they were taken out of the first movie and changed a little and slapped back together. No sense of time passing, and certainly they're the same age physically. It doesn't make any sense. It's not believable at all. It doesn't work. 1.5 star. This movie was so bad it killed the whole X-Men franchise, and when you watch the movie you'll understand. The villain is hopeless, weird, stupid, and boring. Don't watch, even ironically. Well, I'll say I agree that the villain, it doesn't make sense. You have this Jessica Chastain's evil Skrull character who's not really completely evil at times, but sometimes she is. And, she says that she's there to follow this energy force to get its power, and that's part of the story. However, she's also there to take over the Earth, and yet with all these shape-shifting abilities these Skrull-like aliens have, they don't spend a lot of time doing any of that. It's like they're stupid. They only do it when the plot needs it to happen. The rest of the time, they just forget they have these powers. I don't get it. It's like this movie's all over the place. 3 stars. Admittedly rushed final, has plenty to like due to a great cast. I give the film credit for pulling something together when they were expecting a two-parter. The film gives nearly everyone time to shine and is one of the few X-Men movies that actually feels like it is an ensemble piece. I disagree with that. I don't know about this being a two-parter, if that was the original plan. I don't find that as an excuse. It didn't feel like it felt like it didn't feel like something that was chopped out of a two-parter at all to me. It felt like a half-ass effort. As far as giving equal time to the different characters, I completely disagree. This film overwhelmingly puts most of the effort, most of the super-powered work that was done on the character that can teleport. I don't know his name. Is it Nightcrawler? He did everything. Like, he was the driving force from the beginning to the end. Without his powers, a lot of things would have never happened or worked. A lot of the other characters would have been ineffective. So no, I completely disagree. This was basically Nightcrawler's movie, for better or worse. So the idea that these other characters all work together as an ensemble, nope. If you took Nightcrawler out, all their ensemble stuff would have been even more ineffective than it was. And again, it was ineffective because a lot of the characters just chose not to use their powers for no particular reason when the plot suited. Yeah, so I'm not going to read a 3.5 star, 4-star review. No way, no how. So let's see what we have. 3 stars, I don't even want to read the 3-star reviews, but I'm going to because that's my rule. 3 stars. What is X-Men Dark Phoenix? Well, first of all, it's not X-Men Dark Phoenix. It's Dark Phoenix. Let's get that straight. There is no X-Men Dark Phoenix. I said at the beginning, I'll say it again. It is just Dark Phoenix, and you need to meditate on why that is. It's a comic book adaptation, yes, but this might be ugly and bad at times, but it also gets fun at certain action sequences, especially the train one. The story is interesting as an adaptation to a story I haven't read myself yet, but listened to a Watch Mojo video on, and even with certain performances off, I know Fassbender gave his all and does that in everything he is in. Dark Phoenix to me might be pretty close to 3 stars, but I feel I can give it at least 3. So they're saying they don't even believe in the 3 stars they gave it. That's pretty telling. They're also saying that, well, they haven't read any of the comics. They don't know what's supposed to be happening, but it was okay. And they're pointing out the train sequence. Well, I have read about the train sequence. I didn't find it that spectacular or entertaining. I thought it was just passable, but certain people rave about that train sequence. Well, the train sequence was when they brought other people in to fix this movie when the movie had already been shot. Yeah, that's pretty telling. So for people to say the train sequence saved it or the train sequence is magnificent, which I've heard people say, yeah, that tells me what a disaster the movie was, because that train sequence wasn't there to begin with. That was put in by the fixers brought in to fix this mess. But anyway, let's move on. 1 star, May 25th. Thank you for ruining my childhood. I don't see how it ruined your childhood. I mean, did it retcon all the comics? Did it? No, it didn't. It retconned other X-Men movies, sure. But it's like every X-Men movie's been retconning the previous ones, other than the first two, right? The Bryan Singer originals. Um, they were consistent. This X-Men First Class and beyond, yes, they continually further retcon things. Time travel used to do it, and other just retconning without the time travel. Um, yeah, that's the problem. That's why somebody needed to kill this franchise before this movie was made, because everyone just makes it more convoluted and confusing, and it makes the characters more disjointed and not believable. But it doesn't ruin your childhood. That's a little, let's not get that hyperbolic, but half a star, just terrible. Words cannot describe this. No words can, or I wouldn't be here. 3.5 stars. Sorry, that's not going to fly with me. 1 star, unwatchable, terrible dialogue, bad acting, just horrible. Well, I have to say, again, Sophie Turner, you don't expect a lot from her. Nobody does. But you know who was worse? You know who was worse? It wasn't Sophie Turner. It wasn't Michael Fassbender, because he didn't have a lot to do. What was worse was Jennifer Lawrence. Jennifer Lawrence, I don't know, but it seems like her number of good performances in all types of movies has taken a dive. I don't know what it is, but maybe it's her choice in roles. But she does not do this film any favors. Even with a good script, her acting, it's like she just doesn't care. She really doesn't. Now, Sophie Turner, it seems like she cares. Whether she's very good or not, she cares to try. Jennifer Lawrence, maybe she thinks she's achieved some kind of status where she doesn't have to try as hard anymore, but it really shows here, whatever's going on. I don't know. Everybody else, Michael Fassbender, James McAvoy, they're not bad. It's just the script doesn't have them do a whole lot that means anything. But let's move down. Let's see, 3 stars, May 21st. Honestly, after watching Dark Phoenix several times, I wouldn't sit through it a second time, but okay. After watching Dark Phoenix several times, I came to the conclusion that it is a disappointing and not very epic ending for the saga. It took you several times? Okay, that's just like, I have a big question there. How does it take you several times to determine that it was very disappointing? And yeah, I don't understand that one. There are some salvageable positives, such as the wonderful cast of stars, the special effects, and the glorious soundtrack by Hans Zimmer, but unfortunately the fact that they have rushed to make a new free version of the Dark Phoenix saga made some of the most powerful characters remain in the background, like Storm and Cyclops. Yeah, well, again, I'll say this is a problem with a lot of the X-Men films, especially the newer ones. These These characters are very overpowered when you think about it, and yet in a lot of scenes when they're all together, they just hold back. They don't have anything to do. They choose not to use these powers, and it's like they take turns. It's like they're saying, well, two of the six people standing here are using their powers, so let's just stand here and watch and see what happens. And then when one of them fails, another one conveniently steps in to use their powers. But at no time do all of these five or six characters or more together with all these powers decide to use them at the same time. There are a few scenes in which they do. Again, I'll say X-Men First Class and X-Men Days of Future Past were structured in a way that it was more explainable why they wouldn't be there to use all their powers at the same time. That was better writing. In a lot of these, though, and a lot of these scenes since those two films, in the other films, Apocalypse as well, they just choose to, for no reason, hold back because the plot needs it to happen that way. In particular, in this film, um, Sophie Turner's character, Dark Phoenix, Jean Grey, she kills off Jennifer Lawrence's character. Nobody gets in the way or stops it, and it happens in a way in which she could have been saved even after she was impaled by powers that the other ones had, and yet they make no attempt to do this. Why didn't Nightcrawler just teleport her to the emergency room? That's the simplest thing, but there are other things. There are so many ways. But the script needed her to just die like that because the writers thought that would be dramatic if, Sophie Turner's Jean Grey just accidentally impaled her and they just stood there in shock, and that was supposed to be such a dramatic, over-the-top moment, a moment where the whole narrative turned in the story. But it didn't come across that way. It just came across as the script needing that to happen, and everybody stood there because the script needed them to. It was completely stupid. That's the worst example of it. But there are others. There are others, and not just in this film. It's a big problem. 3 stars? No, I don't understand. You would have to be very new to X-Men, and you just want to see explosions and stuff. And there wasn't anything new in that regard to see in this film. Like, the other films had more inventive use of powers and effects than this film did. This film offered nothing new. In fact, you saw Jean Grey and you saw Magneto with their arms stretched out, fighting to struggle over control of a helicopter, of an old Vietnam era Huey. And there was no special effects used there. I mean, as far as their powers went, they were just grunting really hard and aiming their hands at a helicopter. And that's supposed to be where we've seen this kind of stuff before. Like, how is that an effective use of the X-Men, of a spectacle? There was no spectacle there. So if you're even judging this movie as some kind of spectacle of superpowers and CGI effects of these superpowers, it's still a fail because this stuff wasn't exciting. I watched it and I'm like, what's the point of this exactly? Yeah. 1 star. May 16. Cast seemed way too young and not believable, disappointing. Well, finally somebody kind of touches on, well, why are these characters the same age pretty much they were 30 years before? You saw them in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, now we're in the 90s, and the characters are pretty much only 4 or 5 years older, like they're virtually the same characters with relationships between each other that don't seem to have changed much at all. It's almost like they're strangers still to each other. Makes no damn sense. This is the laziest attempt at, an installment of anything that's taken place over 30 years that I've seen. 2.5 stars. A very unimaginative chapter of the X-Men franchise, yes. With all of the available tools to work with going into this movie, the outcome is very disappointing and shows not only a complete lack of creativity, but also a complete lack of understanding of the X-Men universe and its fan base. I agree. The ending was as if they had no idea how to end the movie, so it just ended when the filming schedule ended. Yeah, that's what I felt too. They didn't know how to end it. They didn't know how to defeat the big bad villain because they hadn't set up the villain as a big bad villain to begin with. They weren't sure if the villain was bad or what she was. So they just kind of had it end on a note that could have been happy, could have been sad. It just didn't it just wasn't an ending. It wasn't a comic book story ending. It wasn't any kind of action movie ending. It just ended because the running time needed to end, and I just felt like, it was like, a teacher assigns a school kid to some essay. They're supposed to work on this essay for an entire semester, and you know along the way, the kid's supposed to be working on it, but he's not. He's just out screwing off with his friends, and he's not really working on his essay. And then when it comes time to turn it in, he's just got that original rough draft paragraph that he started with, and he turns that in and says, screw it, it's good enough. Of course, he fails. That's what this felt like. That kind of effort went into the writing and the production. At some point, they just said, we have to turn something into the studio because there's a release date. It has to release by this date. So, just go with what we have, glue it together somehow, and pass it off. Somehow it'll work. Well, from what I understand, it was a very big commercial failure. So it not only tarnished the X-Men franchise, but it lost the studio a horrendous amount of money. Wow. Anyway, 2 stars. What a snoozer. Are they running out of storylines? It looks like it in this latest version of the franchise. It's hard to believe. How could you say they're running out of storylines? You do know that I'm not even a fan of the X-Men comics, but even I know they've run for decades. And you think there's a shortage of storylines? I'm sorry, but that's ridiculous. 3 stars, wasn't so bad, not great, not bad. It was okay. This I say thank you, no, maybe I will. I don't know what they're saying, but obviously they don't know what they're saying, and I can sympathize with that. At the end of this, I didn't know whether to judge this as rotten or to just, I'd have to think about whether it deserved to be rotten, because it is the X-Men. I mean, they look like they're supposed to, but it's just a piss poor effort. 3 stars though, no. If I had to put a star rating on this, 1.5 stars. It's 1.5 stars. Exactly 1.5 stars. Here's a 1.5 star. Long story short, even the major plot points of the movie fall flat. A few cool CGI action sequences, and that's about it. At points in the movie, the cast seems like they're mailing it in. Yeah, particularly Jennifer Lawrence. The others, I think, mostly they're just kind of confined by the script. I don't know how much they're allowed, how much of their input is allowed. I think very little, because it's like they're just, given what they are to work with, and they just do what they're supposed to do. But in the case of Jennifer Lawrence, it seems like she just didn't give a fuck, really. So yeah, half a star, the worst in the franchise. Runner-up for the worst movie of 2019. Skip this one. Yeah, runner-up. What would the worst movie of 2019 be? I might have talked about it already. Runner-up, I don't know. I think there was quite a few worst movies of 2019. It's like, it'd probably be more accurate to say the top 10 worst movies of 2019, because I know there were quite a few. 2 stars. Bruh, seriously? 64% like this movie? Yeah, I don't know why either. It is literally the same movie as the old one without Wolverine. The Phoenix is just Jean, not a cosmic entity, not a world destroyer, just Jean. Mystique is somehow important. Why? I don't know. She is somehow leader of the X-Men. Yeah, it's more of that retconning that we see between the films. Like, you don't know how these people get the roles they're in. They just are there all of a sudden with this authority. Doesn't work. Mystique gives this a monologue about the women are always saving the men, when literally 2 minutes before, Nightcrawler and Quicksilver save an entire space crew -1, while Mystique sat and called the plays. Yeah, it is weird. It's like part of the movie, it had a couple of scenes where it wanted to divert into some kind of feminist message, but it just abandoned it. It felt like that was an intent at the beginning, but then somebody came along, and one of the things they fixed wasn't just the train scene at the end, but they kind of cut out a lot of stuff that was supposed to be there. And I think there were supposed to be more feminist moments in there, but we got left with just the 1 or 2 scraps, and so it didn't come across as a feminist movie, but I think that was the original intent. Because, yeah, there's a scene in which Jennifer Lawrence makes a point, and just out of nowhere, Her biggest complaint with Professor X is that the women are always saving the men, but really, that's not what happened before. It's like stuff got cut out. So yeah, one half a star. Do you want a story that is boring, overused, and is purely predictable? How about the story of the all-powerful substance killed this poor person? Oh, they are the all-powerful substance now. Well, look no further. We have a film called Lucy for you. Same story, but at least it's 1%. Well, I didn't get any similarity between this and Lucy. What I got was this was like a rehash, an attempted rehash of what we got in the Jean Grey story in the first X-Men films, where she kind of exploded at the end. She couldn't contain her power, and it wasn't done very well there. And it's again, they tried to do it, but they also tried to mix in some stuff with the Skrulls, but they couldn't call them the Skrulls. It's like they failed to tell this, and I don't know the story, this X-Men Dark Phoenix saga that's from the comics. I don't know the story, but I've heard people say that every time this has been done 2 or 3 times, they've tried to do this and they failed. And yeah, obviously, but what's really supposed to happen, I don't know, because from the films, this stuff's so convoluted now. I don't know what the comic book canon is and what the deviations are. It's just all over the place. I can't make any sense of it. 2.5 stars, not worse than Last Stand, not better. What a pity to waste such good actors. Yeah, the actors don't have much to do. They've done what they've been told, but if you watch X-Men First Class and you watch X-Men Days of Future Past, this isn't even in the same. It's not even up to their bootstraps. I mean, this isn't even, it's like it's not even made by the same people. It doesn't even belong in the same series of films. Half a star, awful, can't believe this was actually released. I can believe it was released because it's like they spent money so they had no choice, but it's like they just glued it together and threw it out there and slunk away apparently, because it took me a long time to catch up with this film because it's not like it's all over the place. I mean, it's shown up on HBO like once or twice, but it's not like it's running regularly. It took me quite a while to catch this, and maybe because it's not worth pushing out better content for. It's not out there easy to find, and I'm not going to pay money for it. I hear something's not so great, I'm certainly not going to pay to stream it or whatnot. So I had to wait until it showed up on HBO, and it finally did, where I could catch it in its entirety. And now I understand why people are arguing whether this is worse than Apocalypse. But no, I think Apocalypse was more entertaining than this, despite having a lot of the same types of flaws. 3 stars. I thought this was fine. Dark, which the title plainly informs you, and with some weak effects, but overall fine. A way more pleasurable viewing experience than Apocalypse. Well, there you go. Somebody takes the opposite side. No, I think Apocalypse was actually better, but not a lot better. It was just as bad compared to First Class and Days of Future Past. 2.5 stars. Many rushing to condemn Dark Phoenix as the worst entry in the X-Men franchise have short memories. The Last Stand and Apocalypse have it firmly beaten in that regard. However, the film remains a disappointment, failing to build the least bit of empathy for hollow characters that audiences should love based off the quality of past appearances. The villains, the crux of any superhero film, are generic and unimaginative, but several of the later action scenes do at least make up for the time. No, the action scenes don't. Like, people keep talking about the train sequence and stuff. There wasn't anything new there. We've seen people battle on trains before. I don't get why this is considered so fantastic. Maybe because of the rest of the film is so disappointing? No, it was just passable. As far as, the characters, like I've said, it's like between every film it seems like they're retconned and their roles are different and they're acting different between each other and they don't know each other any better than they did before. It makes no sense. 2 stars, up there with one of the weakest of the X-Men films. Also, Jessica Chastain and her group of followers are amongst some of the worst Marvel villains assembled on screen. Yeah, what they do doesn't make sense. We don't even get the feeling that they're villains entirely. And they're obviously scrolls that have been repurposed for whatever licensing reason or whatever. Maybe because Captain Marvel was out at roughly the same time. Maybe that was the problem. I don't know. But definitely they were supposed to be the Skrulls. 2.5 stars. X-Men franchise ends with a final installment that goes through the motions. The actors look bored. The plot is recycled. A major character's death comes off as a so what moment. The villain is actually worse than the one in Apocalypse. 2 nice action sequences liven up an otherwise dull film. I don't think action sequences should excuse anything in a film with so many other problems. This thing could have had 10 fantastic action scenes and it still wouldn't have made any sense. Right away, the characters haven't aged. Right away, they're retconned from the way they were before. Makes no damn sense. Action, that's the least of the movie's problems. Come on. 3 stars. Perhaps judged unfairly for doing what the comics have been doing for decades, retelling a story we've seen before. This version has both improvements and failings compared to the previous film version, and neither is clearly better than the other. They are simply different takes. This version is noticeably less camp, although it is a matter of taste whether the super serious take in Dark Phoenix is preferable without having to compete with the other storylines of The Last Stand. I thought in The Last Stand, the story of Jean Grey kind of, if you want, going Dark Phoenix, if that's what you want to call it, just not knowing anything about the comics made more sense. It felt like it fit better, but it wasn't fantastic. This one, it's like it has something to do with an energy force that starts at the beginning of the film, a mysterious energy force that comes to Earth and is separate really than the villains in the story. This one is worse than The Last Stand, definitely. The Last Stand had problems, but this one is worse. Half a star. Overcomplicated an existing story and took away from the character development to do so. Didn't utilize the powers of the mutants on screen and didn't introduce new ones. Yeah, you got nothing new. Some of the mutants stood around while the others carried everything, notably Nightcrawler. You saw more inventive use of cinematography, if you will, and special effects in the other ones, the soundtrack, seeing Quicksilver and the soundtrack of Annie Lennox and the Eurythmics playing while he saved people in prior installment. That was far better. Here there wasn't anything inventive like that. It was just more boring, nothing new, nothing campy, nothing humorous really. It tried to play it all serious, but Dark Phoenix, it wasn't that dark. It was just boring and nonsensical. So anyway, this has gone on long enough. 2019 Dark Phoenix. I don't know why it's as high as 64%. I guess it's probably from a lot of newer people that aren't familiar with the older films, don't understand how this doesn't fit in, don't understand how the characters don't make sense with the way they were before, don't understand the retconning, so therefore they're not as confused by it. But yeah, partly I think the reason it's this high is because the X-Men franchise stretches across such a big time period, of real life years. So a lot of people that saw this and rated it probably haven't even seen all the other movies. And so I'd say that's why the score is so high. The audience score deserves to be as low as the critic score. It really does. I would say it's more fair if the audience score were around 30%. That would seem more realistic to me. But it is what it is. It's at 64%. It's not considered rotten by my own rules on this show, but I have to take the contrarian opinion and just say that this thing is really rotten. Don't let that audience score fool you. In this case, the critics, they're pretty much right, but then again, they're usually right for the wrong reasons. No accounting for that. And so there we have it. Dark Phoenix, not called X-Men Dark Phoenix for a reason. It's up to you what that reason is, but I have ideas. In any case, I will see you on the next episode of Rotten Reviews.